Equine Piroplasmosis or Babesiosis is caused by a couple of different parasites, and probably you're all familiar with them. Both Babesia cabae and Babesia equi, and then I don't know what the deal is why NBSL consists on Tyleria equi. I know that taxonomists have to justify their existence by changing the name on things all the time, so it probably has something to do with that. But anyway, historically, pretty much it's a disease that's been spread by blood being transferred from one horse to the other, and ticks have been the major vehicle of transmission. But then there are some ways that blood can get transferred by other means. We have seen some vertical transmission where a mare will transmit it to her foal directly, but that doesn't seem to be real common based on what we've seen. Okay, and clinical signs can be all from inapparent to death. And in this outbreak, we've seen very few clinical signs among the affected animals. And it's endemic in tropical areas, and I suppose that has to do more with the vectors than anything else. And tropical areas of Mexico and Central and South America, Africa, and pretty much anywhere we have a tropical climate, you're going to have this disease. And as far as for the U.S., and I did notice it says that all horses except those from Canada and Iceland are required to be tested at the U.S. Import Center. And there is, I know, one variation to this, and that would be animals from Mexico, and they're tested actually at the port while they're held prior to entry. And those samples go up to NBSL along with other tests that are done, and the results come back, and then they're released. And up until 2005, we used the complement fixation test as our test that required for entry into the U.S. And some of our problem relates back to that. And, because we discovered that chronically infected animals are often negative to the CF. And so we know, in fact, we were letting animals that were negative on that test into the U.S., and now we found them positive later. We do use the C. ELISA test, which remains positive pretty much throughout the life of the animal once it becomes affected. We'll show you some exceptions to that have to do with treatment. So, currently it's still considered a foreign animal disease in the United States. I don't know when and if that might change, but that's the designation it has now. Historically, there was an outbreak back in the 60s in Florida. It took them into the 80s to get that cleared up. And there are several competent tick vectors that are present in the U.S. that can help transmit this disease. And more recent outbreaks, as they had a smaller outbreak in Florida in 2008 and in Missouri in 2009, both of those associated with unsanctioned racing, your brush track type of events. And then the one that we have now that started in 2009 here in Texas, and basically 413 horses associated with that. So the index case in this outbreak, we might still not have known about it except for a astute practitioner who basically was examining one of the horses from this particular premises because it had some fever and wasn't doing very well. And so he ran some different tests, and one thing he noted was anemia, and he thought, this just might be piroplasmosis. So he sent a blood sample into Texas A&M, and they did a smear, and lo and behold, hey, that looks like equi. So that sample was sent on to NBSL for confirmation, and sure enough, it was positive. This ranch of origin is a large ranch in South Texas, and anyway, we got out there and started testing animals, and basically came up with 292 positives out of the 360 that they had. And it was the same organism, the equi, and it didn't matter what division of this ranch it was, they had positives on all of them. For the most part, they're working cow horses. They did have a breeding operation and did sell some animals, but mostly they bred animals for use on the ranch. Talking over with the management there, they didn't do any of their risky practices such as sharing needles or other things that are associated with transmission of blood-borne diseases. So we were pretty much sure that it wasn't because of that. And they did have very, very heavy tick infestations when we first went out. That's pretty much mine. And this just happens the location of their ranch. And I'm not going to say their name, but probably a number of you in this room have heard just exactly what ranch this is. And see, it's a large ranch that involves several counties. So, when our people went out there, we also had people from our tick force go, so that they were scratching the horses for ticks. At the same time, we were collecting blood samples to send into NVSL. And these were the 4 main species of ticks that we did find on them, and they are in order of prevalence, with Amblyomma cajunense, the cayenne tick, being the most common, Amblyomma maculata, the second, and Babesia variopolis, which is a very common tick in the U.S., was the third. Now both, so we took samples of these ticks where we were able to keep them alive and sent them up to ARS at Washington State University. And these ticks were then placed on horses that were negative, and 2 different of the ticks actually caused conversion to infection in those negative horses. And the cayenne tick, they're the first one, basically that had been identified as being a possible vector in the past. And the other one, Babesia variopolis, in vivo they had demonstrated that it had the potential to transmit infection, but I don't think it had been proven to transmit equi. So that was a big finding for us, and especially the cajunense, because not only had it not been demonstrated to be a vector in the past, but also there were so many of them on. I mean, horses were just loaded with them. And here's a slide showing basically the distribution of this. Unfortunately, it's not a tick that occupies much of the U.S., and it's really only established in that southern portion of Texas, with the exception of a couple of counties. So it certainly is important in this outbreak, but thank goodness it's not likely to cause problems in much of the U.S. Oops, too far. This thing. Okay, so, here's a ranch that's bred a lot of horses, sold horses. Well, we got some tracing work to do. So we started out, and we went for the first 5 years first, from 2009 back to 2004, and then when we found positives all through that range, then we went back a little further. And as you can see, we went back to 1998. The only reason we went back that far was that was as good a records as they could provide us. And so basically, overall, there were 164 horses that had been left the ranch, either direct sales or through some big horse sales, and 45% of those came out positive, and they were in 16 different states. And one thing to note, the rate of positive horses declined the further back we got. 2009, horses that had left in 2009, I don't remember what the rate was, but it was much higher. I think it was about 80% maybe. And then as it went further back, as we got further down, there weren't near as many positives. But we still were finding a few. And then in our subsequent to all this, as states adapted testing requirements, animals were tested that weren't known to be associated with the outbreak, and there were a couple of positive horses found. One that had been in a herd in New Mexico since 1990, and it had left King Ranch at that time, and had been up in this, used on this cattle ranch up in the mountains where ticks weren't much of a problem. And basically, lo and behold, it was positive. And, the evidence of the investigation indicated, they tested the rest of the horses on the ranch, didn't find anything. And so we're pretty sure that horse left the index premise, infected back in 1990. So, we're pretty sure the infection goes at least back that far. So that's quite a while. And why it wasn't detected? Well, we didn't have any testing requirements. And so, it just went along, over time increased in prevalence, and then finally it was caught. So, overall in the outbreak, 2,500 horses tested with 413 positive horses identified. And in South Texas, we had traces to a number of premises in the area, and some of those came up positive, and those were the only areas where we could demonstrate further transmission from the horses that left the King Ranch. Oops. Well, anyway, from the index premise, there actually was transmission after these horses left the premise to other horses on the ranch. And basically, anywhere else, we never saw any spread that would be due to ticks. I think there was one where a foal that was born after the horse left the ranch, there was transmission to that. But pretty much other than that, there wasn't any transmission. And basically, we've looked at, well, what went on here that made it so get such high prevalence. And we think it was a number of things. I think it just was building up over years and years, and a very high infestation rate with the ticks, and then long periods of time to establish blood levels that cause this. And anyway, there has been some think, well, maybe it's because it's far enough south that the ticks are present year round, and that sure could be. We don't know what, but this ranch and another one that's pretty close to there, both of them had very high prevalences. And another thing, we tested adjacents, everything within several miles away from this ranch, and we never found it unless animals had actually moved, left the index premise and went to these other ranches around. So, the ranch next door that had, maybe 105, 110 horses, I can't remember, that was right next to the fence line adjacent, never found anything. So it was associated with the movement, but if they were in the right area, then you would get transmission via ticks. Got everything there. Okay, since then, there's been a lot of testing done, and we have found some additional positive horses. And due to surveillance testing and requirement for movement and that kind of thing. And the states have imposed movement restrictions. We keep coming up with positives. New Mexico was the first one to start that on their racing quarter horses. And sure enough, they've started finding positives. And so more and more states adapted requirements that animals had to be tested to enter the tracks. And I don't know if this list is complete as of now, but it's at least ones that I knew about, and the states that do require testing to enter tracks. And if I guess, in my opinion, if you're especially racing quarter horses, I would be certainly probably want to require tests. And just recently, the AQHA requires testing for animals coming into their world shows. And this is a figure that Dr. Pelzel had. About approximately 100,000 horses have been tested in the past year at NVSL and other approved labs for EP. And from this testing, you can see we've found basically 159 total positive horses, with 151 of them being equi and 8 being Babesia cavalli. And so, if you correlate that, that's over a little over a period, over a year's period. But if you take that back to the number of testing, we're probably talking somewhere around 0.1% positive. So, with all the horses in the U.S., that's no small number. And as we would expect, a lot of them in Texas and New Mexico, and North Carolina has a pretty good number there. And I don't know what that means, other than maybe it's a climate factor, but most of these horses that are tested for movement have been quarter horses. We'll get into that, show you, but the risk factors are a little different, it appears. Okay. So basically, we have two different groups outside of the initial South Texas ranch outbreak of horses that have come up positive. And one has been horses imported prior to 2005 when we were using the CF test. And basically, 20 positive horses. And a number of them in Texas were related to some circus or performing horses that were imported from Russia. And so, it's pretty easy to explain that, although they came in with a disease. Unfortunately, in most instances, it doesn't look like there was any transmission because other horses we tested there, we never found any positives. Now, if they'd been imported to South Texas and got a lot of ticks, it could have been different. But for the most part, the ones we saw in Texas were in the northern part of the state, and we didn't see any transmission. The other are in these race horses that have been tested. You can see it was 126 positive quarter horses and 12 positive thoroughbreds. And there's no evidence of tick-borne transmission in any of these. Let's see, I guess I can pick that. Oops. Okay. And really, it looks like, in a lot of cases, these are horses, not only do they race in sanctioned tracks, but they're involved in brush track racing, and there is a lot of evidence that they may have been involved with blood doping or some other things that certainly could have transmitted the disease. Another thing we found in a lot of these quarter horses is sometimes the ownership is a little suspect. Wonder about the possibility that some of them may have come into the United States illegally, but can't prove it. So, as a result of the outbreak in South Texas, a National Equine Piroplasmosis Working Group was established, and we had the members from state, federal, research, and industry, and basically they came up with some interim control guidelines and long-term recommendations, and I haven't seen those, so I don't know just specifically what they have to do with, but some of the things, additional response recommendations, what we should do for surveillance, education, and outreach. And I think that's a big area to try to get people to watch their practices so that they don't transmit the disease. And what's needed for research. Should we change our import requirements? And national disease status is where are we still going to consider this a foreign animal disease? And so anyway, this I think is ongoing. And like I said, it's been submitted to the leadership, and I haven't seen the outcome of that. But for people that have positives now, they have several choices. Initially, we were not supporting euthanasia. We were kind of trying to discourage it, but a lot of owners, due to their situation and their inability to keep animals separate, have euthanized positive horses. But the other options are a long-term quarantine, and as long as they do the right things to make sure that ticks aren't an issue, and then there's very little risk with that. Initially, in Texas, we had thought about allowing them to attend events. Maybe trail rides and things like that, but the groups associated with those didn't want any part of that. So basically, they're stuck at home or wherever they decide to quarantine them, and they're not allowed to be permitted to places where they might expose other horses. And export out of the country has occurred, mostly back to Mexico. I know that just recently somebody was working on the possibility of sending some to the UK. And the other option is a long-term quarantine with enrollment in a treatment program. And basically, initially, there wasn't any treatment that had been shown to be very effective against Theileria equi. And animals have been treated both at the Index Ranch and some other animals, and it's showing a lot of promise. And breeding of positive horses to negative horses is allowed with the proper precautions, making sure that they don't have, they're sprayed for ticks and that kind of thing. And that's happened, especially with some valuable race horses have been allowed to breed. And as I mentioned before, they're not currently allowed to move to events, races, or shows. Oops, just a little far here. Just about done. If I can get back to where I'm. Okay. So I mentioned three distinct populations. Texas, the racing industry, and previously imported horses. And natural born transmission is only, seems to be a problem in South Texas. There may be other areas of the U.S. that have enough of those ticks that it could happen, but so far that's the place that we've really seen it occur. And as I mentioned, the iatrogenic means of transmission has appeared to be the problem in the racing industry. And surveillance, testing, and outreach are both important and may be a way to stop, the spread within that racing industry. And treatment does look to be a promising exit strategy, and I'll show you some results. This is preliminary that Don Knowles up at Washington State sent me just last Friday. And this is some horses that he's treated. And I don't know if these are all from the Index Ranch or because I know there are some others enrolled as well. But as you can see, if you look at overall, the 72 horses that they treated using the nested PCR to try to detect, after a period of treatment, whether they were still infected, the 71 of them came up negative and only one was positive. And then they took 24 of those, including that positive horse, and did a blood transfer study into splenectomized horses, and 23 of those were negative, and the one positive is the same horse. So that looks really good that the treatment may be working. I don't just know what quite the protocol was, but I know that it was several injections with imidocarb, and it does have a lot of promise. And a lot of these went CLISA negative as well, and he was telling me yesterday that they've got another serological test that really looks good and may be really good to confirm that we have cleared infection in treated horses. So, but anyway, 71 looking really like they're negative out of 72 horses. That has a lot of